There was another thing in the United States. The State Department and other services always kept saying, even when changing Cuba was clearly underway, that nothing changed and everything was just for the Bühne, as the Germans say, just for fake, to show something that didn't exist in reality. We thought, as Netherlands, that yes, things change really. And we told the Americans, and we've been in a privileged position where we're one of the few that could tell them things, because not everybody has been asked to tell. And State Department, by the way, has not been involved, essentially as far as we know, in most of the negotiations, and we're not aware of much of it. It's really been done by the White House. And the issue was, one of the core issues was, Americans should travel freely all over the world. It's a constitutional right, why not to Cuba? And the other one was, well, if Americans roam the country, go throughout everywhere in Cuba, if many can go there, Cubans get real information for first hand, which they can't receive now at this stage. And the same argument was valid for other measures that President Obama announced, to the surprise of almost everybody, although I think that a Cuban president knew it, where he said, well, here you have a package. Every private business in the construction sector, every private business in the rural areas, in agriculture, everyone who wants to bring internet and modern communication to Cuba, all linked for him to essentially to promoting freedom in the country, free traveling throughout the country, all these issues, we need to address them, and we need to address them now. So I give to the Cubans the right for private business to buy in the United States, in sectors I just named. Now the problem is that Cuba is a state economy and imports and exports are in the hands of the government. So you give such a beautiful package, and they prefer a Chinese, I guess, a control system on internet than the American internet companies. It's a difficult gift you give to swallow. And what are you going to do? How are you prepared to handle that kind of things? Yes, your society is changing. And 2 years ago, the Minister for External Economy, the Vice President of the Council of Ministers, told me already informally, we know we have to roll out internet throughout the country. And we need to do it fast, because we can't change the economy if we don't go into the modern area. So he gets this package. Cuba gets this package. While they even haven't told internally to the party, to administration, to many of the ministers that they had been negotiating, and at least what would be the outcome? That they would re-initiate diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba. And in fact, the United States always remained present diplomatically. There has always been a 400-person embassy looking out over the magic Malecon, the boulevard that is the 8-kilometer boulevard on the beach. But it was part of the Swiss embassy, like the Cuban embassy in Washington was part of the Swiss embassy there. But then they decided we're going back to normalcy. So we're going to open our embassies respectively. And then what President Obama did, and that is directly important for St. Martin and for this industry, he decided, well, instead of allowing what they called people-to-people context, that meant that Americans that wanted to meet Cubans in an organized way, they went for 1 week to Cuba, and then the Cuban government took you by the hand and showed you a few Cubans left and right. Everything was organized, no freedom to go around. And the idea was, from the American side, it brings people at least a little bit together. What the president said, but at every trip you had to ask permission for. And it was very cumbersome, and the Ministry of Finance needed authorized companies to bring Americans that way to Cuba. Only Cuban Americans could travel more freely. So there were 80,000 Americans outside the Cuban Americans that went to Cuba on a yearly basis, slightly increasing. And all of a sudden President Obama says, well, I'm done with it. I'm going to authorize a number of categories of people, but I'm only going to control it afterwards. So everyone gets a license. You say it's people to people, or it's religious, or it's sports, or it's culture. All these categories, you can now travel freely. And if you go to Cuba as a private passenger on a ship, or on a ferry, or on a plane, you just tick the box where you say, hey, it's people to people, and you can go freely. And we control it after a year. And the idea, of course, being we don't control anything. We just authorize it because we need that freedom of movement. So the first impact was that Americans start to travel to Cuba. Yeah. Bear in mind, the 3 countries in the Caribbean from the kingdom and the 3 territories, they have together, let me guess, Prime Minister, you're good in figures. If am I on the low side when I think that there must be approximately 4.5 million, 5 million tourists coming to globally to the 6 Ministers of Finance always have figures. Well, I think it must be 2 million here, a little bit more. It must be 1 million to Aruba, well, a bit more to Aruba, in fact. 1.6 must be, I'm not far from it. So let's say between 4 and 5 on the safe side. Cuba had, with difficulty, 2.8, 2.9 million tourists. Now we're talking about 110,000 square kilometers. It has nature on top, it is nature underneath. 8,000 kilometers of reefs if you count everything, including the world's most beautiful diving spot. It's not Australia. It is the Jardines de la Reina, south of Camagüey in the middle of Cuba. It's the extension of the reef that you all, of course, been diving. Mexico, that goes to Belize. It's beautiful. I'm a diver, so that's why I talk about it. So you have cities 500 years old. There's a whole series of them presently, just Santiago 2 months ago, that are now having festivities because they're 500 years old. And the good thing of having a bad economy is everything remains as it was. Now, if you open up the country and the economy, the good thing is you can restore it. And now, I need to take some. So you have a whole string of cities throughout the country that are perfect cruise destinations, because most of them are moreover linked in one way or another to port facilities. There are 32 ports in Cuba. Well, many of them are not that easily accessible, but just bear it in mind. So there you have a whole series of cities that are fascinating. Who invented son? Who invented rumba? Who invented salsa? Who invented probably a reggaeton that's slightly less the favorite of everybody above 60? Okay, right, and under 5. Now, who invented, so you just can continue. If you look to the Chucho Valdez's, to the Cecilia Cruz's, if you look to jazz, the jazz scene, you go to Cuba, you have it. You go to ballet, you have it. You go to classical music, you have it. We made a little mistake. We thought we went last week to Carmen, and in fact it proved to be in flamenco Carmen, so we left after 50 minutes, right? Once you see the 15 steps, for 15 minutes you think you know them for the rest of your life. No, that's a joke. Many of you practice, of course, flamenco, so right. Now, so that country has an enormous capacity, but it has been sleeping. And now, all of a sudden, tourists can come. So the tourist influx over the first 6 months of the year has been up above 25%. So prospects for this year are all of a sudden moving up from 3 million to 4 million and beyond. But it's only the beginning. 20,000 hotel rooms are under construction for the next 4 years. And no longer the low quality where you get, as I said before, the drunk Canadians, because they have an all-in, that means drink as you come. Canadians that go to Cuba, it's fascinating. Some of you, all right, some people are laughing, so they've been doing the Canadian stuff, right? So you buy your all-in package and you get from your travel agency your mug. And you get that mug because Cuban hotels have plastic goblets if they have them. So if you're a Canadian, they tell you, take your mug and you present it to the bar and they fill it up with rum coke or mojito and you just drink all night. And that's exactly what happens. These Canadians bring you $40 per day as a per medium in your economy. Here we talk about $180 per day for a tourist on a cruise. That's different stuff. So what's happening is that Cuba is moving into higher gear. And that higher gear is 20,000 rooms more, but you get Kempinski opening on short notice in Havana. You're getting golf courses. The first contracts have been signed with a Chinese-British company, mixed company. You have marinas that are now going to be developed. And you have a new investment law that's been in place since the beginning of last year. You have a free trade zone of 620 square kilometers, if I'm right. 622, maybe, okay, right, something of the kind. Above 600 square kilometers. Singapore Harbor, moving the container port that can double its capacity easily. And that part is functioning very well. The Brazilians came in. Why did they finance Mariel? Because they think, well, this embargo is on its way out. And Cuba is the perfect passage from the east coast of Latin America to the east coast of the States. With the Panama Canal just down and the deepwater ports like Mariel just sitting there waiting to be used, as happened in the past when the silver fleet from the Spaniards moved from the continent to Havana to cross the Atlantic. So in, which year was it? 1632. Piet Hein attacked in the Bay of Matanzas the silver fleet of the Spaniards, and that was the beginning of the end of the 80 Years' War between the Netherlands and the Spaniards. That Cuba, that bay is still there. By the way, I just discovered on a trip 2 weeks ago that we also had 2 pirate villages in the center of the country on the southern coast. So we probably should reinvigorate that, and if we don't do it, the Cubans will do it, because it will be a tourist attraction. So you have a highly diverse country that's waking up from a ridiculous 3 million tourists compared to what it could be. And what have we seen now over the past 7-8 months? That from all sides, missions chaired by presidents. Yesterday, the president of Panama was there with the port of Panama and numerous businesses. We see that missions in the past 2 weeks from Belgium, from Serbia, just before that France, Italy twice, Germany for the first time. They were just coming in from everywhere. And the usual Chinese come anyway all the time. Where are my friends? Where are my friends? I love this. Right. When ministers start laughing about it, I hit something true, isn't it? Good. No, so they come in from all sides. The Russians made a deal with Cuba over their outstanding debt, and Cuba is moving forward to arrange its debt issue. They defaulted. They stopped paying their debt to the Western countries in 2008. And they are now negotiating. They opened up the books. We have consolidated figures. And at this very moment, the talks are starting to find a solution for the debt issue with the Western countries. That excludes, by the way, the United States. They're not a member of the OECD. And that means that Cuba, that has no internal capacity to invest in this infrastructure. The government has no hard currency. That's a big problem for Cuba, hard currency. The bank system is Cuban. They don't have hard currency. By the way, American banks can now open to fund the American investments or trade with Cuba. They can now open bank accounts in Cuba with a Cuban national bank. Well, this is limited with the embargo, as you can understand. And Parliament in the States will not be very happy about it. They're even talking about opening a credit line for American businesses that want to do business with Cuba in the fields that are now allowed. That's moving fast. You don't see it, you don't read it, but it's under elaboration. So, we see mission after mission coming in, and we see, amongst others, in the cruise business, that people are lining up. Norwegians, Canadians, American companies, definitely, Swiss, including for ferries. The Americans have offered to do ferries. Now, Cuba doesn't want to have only American companies. In fact, they don't want to have more than 20 or 30% impact of the American economy and the Cuban economy, because they learned a little bit the lessons from first Russia and then Venezuela. And they want 20-30% for Europe and the remainder for the remainder of the world, including China. Can they manage it? Maybe in the beginning. In the end, it will be difficult. But the companies are lining up. The ferry services have been offered. The Americans have made 3-4 offers already, and others are coming, including one mixed Dutch-Cuban. In fact, it's going to be Dutch, I think. And the Cubans will now approve. I learned that from the first Deputy Minister of Transport last week. They will give the first ferry to a Swiss company. Now, all that means that we are in a significant period of change. And we all see that at this moment, the build-up of foreign interest is gigantic. Why? No one wants to miss the train as soon as the embargo fully goes. Now we are, of course, in the crystal ball, right? We know the factors that can end fully the embargo, which is already dented now, but right? So we know what the factors are that come into account, including the presidential election. Beginning of this year, less than 50% of the Americans wanted the embargo to go. 2 weeks ago, 70% wanted the embargo to go. You can ignore that for some time, but you can't ignore it forever. Now, in 2 states that are critical for the elections, particularly one, Florida, the Cuban-American community is 20%, Miami half. They have huge weight, but even inside the Cuban-American community, more than half, everyone under 40 thinks, get rid of it, except Ted Cruz and except Marco Rubio. But for reasons that are not mine. But so what we do see is that outside those under the younger generations, Cuban Americans start to act as Latin Americans in the United States, and they are in favor of restoring relations with Cuba. As has been pressing over the past 2 years, all the Latin American, Caribbean, and Central American countries, from all sides, including old allies of the United States, like Mexico, like Colombia, and like Chile, to the very surprise of many of the American leaders, have started to say, we want you to normalize with Cuba. And that didn't fall on deaf ears, because America has lost lots of its standing in a more and more self-conscious Latin America. So you need to listen. And that message also crossed through to the White House even before it landed strongly, in my opinion, in the State Department. So what you did see is that everything built up to a major change in American policy. Now, is it a run race? No, it's never. Because elections are unpredictable. Turn of events, we don't know. Now we have all of a sudden Trump moving in. Well, that might play in the hands of the Democrats. And the Democrats are now formally, all of them opposed to the embargo, including Hillary Clinton, whose husband signed off on the Helms-Burton Act, the third element of the embargo in 1995, and who until a few years declared that she was in fact in favor of the embargo. Now, they've read the papers and they know where things stand. So they've said, we make it a battle horse. Does Cuba stand in the center of attention in the elections in the States? No, it doesn't. But it has impact and influence at moments that can be critical. So what do we see? Things will continue to change, and the embargo, we know it's going, we only don't know when it will be gone. 6 months? 6 years? Well, the last is not probable, but it is accelerating. There are difficult issues. Cubans that went to the United States, including businesses, are putting heavy claims on the Cuban government. Not so much because the original claims for privates, it's about $100 million, but a $6 billion interest and further claims on top of it. But we already saw that the biggest sugar producers and the most influential sugar producers in the United States, the Fajul family, kicked out of Cuba in '59 when they were, of the 4 big families, the 4th, not the biggest one. They've come back to Cuba, including their bankers on the second trip when I had the pleasure to talk to them. They've been coming back to Cuba with the lawyers, the bankers, and I'm absolutely certain that the deal is already more or less being hammered out. Now, that's a conviction. I have no proof, but talking to them and knowing how things went, whom they saw at which level, top. There you can be certain that there again, they're willing to drop their claims on Cuba if they get something in exchange. That's what the Spaniards did, by the way, in the 80s. So all that means that you will see the investors come in. Now, the new investment law is in place. There are 2 Dutch businesses that are going to invest this year in Mariel. They present this month their final proposals, and they will be agreed upon, we know that already, within 2 months. We have a trade mission, a kingdom trade mission, not a Dutch European trade mission, going to Cuba in the beginning of January, headed by our Minister of External Trade and Cooperation, Liliane Ploemen. There's a huge trade fair in November where we have a kingdom stand of 600 square meters. We hope to see presidents from St. Martin as well. And things are evolving fast. Now, what about St. Martin in all this? And I now look, I've been talking so much that I probably didn't forget anything, but you never know. Oh, at least one thing I forgot. What did the Netherlands do? Now, so, first of all, yeah, let me pick up that one. It's interesting because we have a special position as Netherlands Kingdom in Cuba. In the, how many of you do remember seeing Fidel Castro first in a non-military suit? Yeah, no one raised his hand. I saw a hand somewhere over there. How many of you know that the one who put him in a normal suit was a Dutch stylist? Right. Now, she knows it because she knows her. In fact, what happened? In the early 60s, when the embargo started, Cuba needed to export its nickel. And they didn't manage to get the nickel out of the country. And then a Dutch businessman was approached. If there are questions, I can tell you the full story. I'm not certain he would like it, but okay. He went around and managed to sell in short notice 2 ships that were floating and no one dared to intervene in favor of Cuba, and he did. It was his daughter who put Fidel for the first time in a civil suit. But from that came other Dutch investments. And moreover, we had in that period a fruitful dialogue with Cuba. Jan Pronk had been minister for many years. We gave development cooperation that stopped in the 80s, early 90s. But we always had an ongoing dialogue. And then came the black years I talked about in the mid-90s, and the European Union, after Cuba coming down heavily on dissidents, on people who wanted to express their opinion. I don't like very much the word dissident. On people who thought that they had the right, as we think, of freedom of speech. They clamped down hard on them, and Europe closed for Cuba. And we got a totally strained relationship that was based on only one thing. Our attitude not towards Cuba as a whole, but bringing it, narrowing it down to the classical human rights, which are critically important for Europe and for our constitution, yes. But the social human rights were more or less put aside. And in fact, everything was made 100% conditional upon Cuba first becoming a democracy before we wanted to talk again to them. Now, that's very smart when you do it, but not smart if you keep it. And what happened was that Cuba started to open up, right? And then you have to choose what you want. Do you want to stand by a country that changes and help it change not only in the economy but also in all the other aspects of freedom? Or do you want to stay aloof and talk to them at a distance? Well, the Americans couldn't do it at 140 kilometers distance. Why do we think that we could do it from 7,000? And it didn't work. So we decided, well, that is not a very smart policy, and Minister Timmermans broke the ban against the will of many other European ministers and countries, and he said, I prefer to talk with instead of talking about somebody. So in January 2014, Minister Timmermans came to Cuba and said, let's dialogue. We signed half a year before. We brought in, I just had started a year before. As ambassador, we brought in our Director General Political Affairs. That was forbidden as well, and we signed a memorandum of understanding. Well, it's funny because many countries in fact did it, but didn't make publicity about it. Because everyone knows that if you have a position and have a change and the country changes, nothing works. Now, what happened? Timmermans broke it open. And we had a good relationship before. We are the fifth as the European part. We are the fifth trade partner and investment partner of Cuba. We don't shout it on the roofs. The Americans are listening as well. We invest there. We don't want to know too much about it, but we are. And if you take into consideration the fact that much of the oil products from Venezuela cross through our Caribbean kingdom to Cuba, that's $1.5 billion more. It brings us probably to the third, if not the second, trade position with Cuba. Now, the oil issue and Venezuela are unstable factors in my readout, but overall, that is a very strong position. And Cuba has decided recently to prioritize 10 to 12 countries worldwide for the intensification of their trade relations and investment relations, and Netherlands is amongst those. And in fact, we have an extremely good working relationship, amongst others, and I might say particularly in the transport sector, and in the tourist sector, and in the health sector, a few of sectors that are critically important. So, here we are. Cuba has a potential that's been largely gone down the drain, but they have 11 million highly educated people. There are, for every 200 persons, a doctor. That's a world record. They have 80,000 outside the country. That's a world record, of course, as well. By the way, the Americans have a law that any Cuban doctor trained in Cuba with money of the state, that goes to the state, gets automatically an authorization. They try to get them out. That's from the past. That's weakening an economy. But Cuba still produces an enormous amount of medical stuff. So the country is opening up. Investment is coming in. The interest is heavy. There's a new investment law that's highly attractive for the Mariel area. Personally, the information I have is that the Nicaragua channel will come as well, and China is looking clearly to the hub function of Cuba. And in my opinion, this is not going to stop. Now, what does it mean for tourism in St. Martin? Well, you know that better than I do. Essentially speaking, we see that everybody is coming in. Trinidad and Tobago, not exactly a competitor for cruise tourism or tourism in general for St. Martin or Curaçao or Aruba, Bonaire. But they signed weeks after the 17th of December 2014 a tourism deal with Cuba. They moved very fast. From their perspective, if you can't join them, if you can't beat them, join them.